did find someone who would answer my questions, one of the organizers of a small protest after Kerry's speech, a protest against the Keystone XL pipeline. She explains how difficult organizing that protest was.
My name is Alyssa Johnson-Kurtz. I'm with Sustain Us, the U.S. Youth Delegation, and I'm from the state of Vermont.
So right after Secretary Kerry gave his speech, you had a small protest. Can you talk about what your protest was about?
Sure. It was about tar sands specifically and calling out the different infrastructure projects that are transporting tar sands around Canada and around the United States. It was a project with the Canadian Youth Delegation.
Can you talk about what it takes to get a protest approved here at the COP?
Sure. So for this protest, we had to send in a request to the Secretariat, and for any of the actions here, you have to send in a request. And on that request...
Request to who?
Request to the Secretariat, so it's...
The UN?
To the UN, yes. And so you have to send in the information that will be on your banners. You have to send in any slogans that you'll be using. You're not allowed to call out any specific people. So Kerry, while he was here, we're not allowed to specifically name him in our action or on our banners. We're not allowed to use the names of countries, so we couldn't call out the United States or Canada around Keystone XL. We weren't allowed to name specific projects, for example, so we're not allowed to talk about Keystone XL pipeline.
Did you give in a picture of a banner that they said no to?
So we had some issues around getting our banners approved, and we eventually used the banner that said climate action with an arrow in one direction and tar sands with an arrow in the other direction. It was a little bit questionable about whether or not that was going to be approved, but we did end up using it.
Did you submit any others that were denied?
So we tried to submit a banner that would have an arrow with Keystone XL in one direction and a livable future in the other direction, and they rejected that proposal.
Because you weren't allowed to name Keystone XL?
We weren't allowed to name Keystone XL.
You weren't allowed to name Secretary Kerry?
Not allowed to name Secretary Kerry.
You weren't allowed to name the United States?
Not allowed to name any specific countries.
And what if you did?
We would risk losing our badges and hurting our organization's potential for accreditation in the future at the UN spaces.
Do you feel the protest was able to convey your concerns about Secretary Kerry and his involvement in deciding whether the Keystone XL gets approved across the United States?
That was youth activist Alyssa Johnson-Kurtz of the group Sustain Us. Joining us now here in Lima, Peru at the UN Climate Change Conference is Jamie Henn, co-founder and communications director of 350.org, which helped launch the movement against the Keystone XL pipeline. So that's quite amazing what Alyssa has laid out. She said they actually have to send pictures of the banners that they're going to use, and they get rejected or not.
Yeah, it's amazing, Amy, the restrictions that are placed on activists here at the talks. And the irony, of course, is that very few restrictions are placed on the fossil fuel companies that come here. Unlike the World Health Organization, which bans tobacco lobbyists from tobacco control talks, there are no such protections here at the UN. So we find it a bit amusing and disturbing, really, that the UN is putting such restrictions on mentioning a project like Keystone, and yet they let companies like Chevron come in and talk about dreams they have about carbon capture and sequestration.
So how does that work, and has this been raised with the UN Secretariat?
It's been raised repeatedly, and actually there's been a lot of back and forth about the restrictions placed on civil society, everything from the number of badges that people get to come into the talks to things like Alyssa was bringing up about restrictions about banners. People are doing a great job making their voices heard outside of this process in the streets of Lima this week, which you were covering, and then back in New York this September. But we need more access, and we need better ways to make sure that people's voices are coming into this process.
Do you think there's been an increasing separation between civil society and what goes on within the COP as perhaps less work gets done here? I mean, being on the grounds of El Pentagonito, as it's called, the military headquarters that is known as a place where people were disappeared and killed here in Peru. You know, there is military and police, you know, cordoning off the area. Very hard for people from the outside to get in, much more so than any other time.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I think it's a real detriment to the process that's happening here. We've seen civil society be able to really help push forward progress at the talks. I think it would be to the advantage of the UN to really let in more voices and let people continue to get engaged in this process, because decisions are being made that affect people's lives, that affect the politics, but we're not here to be able to push them.
Jamie, talk about what